This is the 800th MTG Top 10. It's kind of insane that I've made that many of these, but I'm only able to do it because of you, the viewers, who actually want to listen to me talk about Magic cards several times a week, so thank you. The channel also recently surpassed 90,000 subscribers, which I, of course, also couldn't have done without you. Anyway, because this is the 800th MTG Top 10, I thought it'd be a good time to look at 8/8 creatures. If a creature is an 8/8, it's obvious that it's pretty massive, so if it's well costed and or comes with some other abilities, an 8/8 can be an incredibly imposing creature. In all, there are 87 cards in Magic that either are 8/8s or that make 8/8 creature tokens, and in this video we'll look at the 10 that have left the biggest impact on competitive Magic the Gathering. This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. Use the links in the description to visit their store. Before we get started, here's a quick reminder on how I rank cards in these videos. A first tier top 8 is worth 2 points. This includes events like Pro Tours, and a second tier top 8 is worth 1 point. This includes events like Regional Championships. At number 10, it's Spectral Force. For 3 generic and 2 green, it has Trample, and when it attacks, if the defending player controls no black permanents, it doesn't untap during your next untap step. Spectral Force is from Time Spiral, a set with lots of callbacks, and this one's a callback to Spectral Bears, a 2-mana 3/3 with the same downside. 5 mana for an 8/8 Trampler is a pretty amazing deal, and oftentimes the way to offset such an efficient creature is to give it a downside, and this certainly has one, although getting to smash in for 8 every other turn for 5 mana is still kind of okay. But you don't even have to deal with that downside if you're playing against a black deck, in which case, there's no problem at all. That might make you think this was a sideboard card, but it actually saw main deck play in Time Spiral Block Constructed, a format featuring lots of black decks. While it was a sideboard card in Standard, it was one that was often brought in against fairy decks. However, it hasn't put up any top 8 since rotating out of Standard way back in 2008. At number 9, it's Woodcaller Automaton. It's an artifact that costs 10 generic mana, and when it enters the battlefield, if you cast it, you untap a land you control and it becomes a treefolk creature with haste and base power and toughness each equal to Woodcaller Automaton's power and toughness, and it's still a land. It also has Prototype, which is an alternate cost and alternate stat line. You can choose to pay 2 generic and 2 green for it instead, in which case it's a 3/3 instead of an 8/8. Either way you cast this, it gives you 2 bodies for a pretty reasonable cost, and one of them even has haste. Its points all came in Pioneer Devotion to Green decks between 2022 and 2023. These decks were great at generating a lot of mana thanks to Nykthos, and these decks like to use Karn, the Great Creator's -2 ability, to grab a win condition, like a singleton Woodcaller Automaton out of the sideboard, because once you had the mana available, casting it for its full cost was usually a game winner. However, Karn got banned out of Pioneer because those decks were so good, and while Devotion to Green decks are still a factor in Pioneer, without access to Karn, they don't run Woodcaller Automaton anymore, so it's probably done putting up top 8s. At number 8, it's Platinum Empyrean. For 8 generic, it's an artifact creature that makes it so your life total can't change. Obviously, that's a super powerful effect that frequently makes it impossible for you to lose, and you also get a huge body that can help you win the game while protecting your life total. Obviously 8 mana is a lot, but it's well worth the effort. That's why it was played in ramp decks in Standard. In Modern, it's been ramped into using Tron lands, but probably the sweetest thing people have ever done with it in Modern is to combine it with Madcap Experiment. If Empyreans are the only artifacts in your deck, you always hit one with Madcap Experiment, and then you don't take any damage from the experiment because of the Empyrean's ability. It's also been reanimated and ramped into in Legacy, and it's even been played in Vintage Mud, a deck that specializes in making lots of mana to cast expensive artifacts. However, Platinum Empyrean hasn't put up any top 8 since 2022. At number 7, it's Phyrexian Colossus. It's an artifact creature that costs 7 generic mana. It doesn't untap during your untap step, but you can pay 8 life to untap it, and it can't be blocked except by 3 creatures. By today's standards, this does not look like much. Sure, it's big and hard to block, but not untapping is a massive downside, and that's true. It was a pretty big downside even back in the late 1990s when creatures were much worse. But the block, standard, and extended of the time were set up in such a way to make the Colossus shine. Urza's block, just had so many cards that made it easy to abuse artifacts. People could put it into play quickly in a number of ways, either by using Tolarian Academy to produce a bunch of mana, or cheat it into play with Tinker. Then, even with the downside, the Colossus would kill your opponent before it ever killed you, and you could even get around the downside by using Voltaic Key to untap it. However, the Colossus has long since been outstripped by better artifact creatures, and it hasn't put up any points since 2003, but there was once a time where this big 8/8 ended a lot of games in multiple formats. At number 6, it's Kiora Best, the Sea God. For 5 generic and 2 blue, it's a Saga. This is an enchantment subtype that has separate chapters. These are kept track of using lore counters, and it enters with 1 and gains another lore counter after your draw step every turn, and each time it gains a lore counter, you get the corresponding chapter effect. In this case, that generally means you get chapter 1 right away, chapter 2 the turn after that, and chapter 3 the turn after that. Kiora Best, the Sea God, qualifies for this list because of Chapter 1, which gives you an 8/8 Kraken token with hexproof. Chapter 2 taps all of your opponent's non-land permanents and they don't untap during the controller's next untap step, and Chapter 3 lets you gain control of a permanent an opponent controls and you untap it. So yeah, Kiora Best, the Sea God is arguably the most powerful saga in Magic, at least in a vacuum, since each of its chapters is individually quite strong, and they get even better together. An 8/8 hexproof token alone can take over a game since it's hard to kill and massive. Chapter 2 makes sure that that token can easily smash in for 8, and Chapter 3 gives you your opponent's best permanent. So it costs 7, and that's a lot, but Kiora Best, the Sea God definitely delivers. It gained all of its points in standard Sultai Ultimatum decks. These are ramp decks that want to cast Emergent Ultimatum, which lets you grab 3 monocolored cards with different names from your library, and your opponent has to choose one of them. The one they choose gets shuffled back into your deck, but then you cast the other 2 for free. Kiora Best, the Sea God is one of the cards you can search up with the Ultimatum to make your opponent make a horrible, horrible choice between the 3 strongest cards in the deck. However, Kiora Best, the Sea God hasn't put up any top 8 since rotating out of standard. At number 5, it's Ulvenwald Oddity. For 2 generic and 2 green, it's a 4/4 with trample and haste, and you can pay 5 generic and 2 green to transform it into an 8/8 with those same keywords, and it gives the rest of your board those keywords and +1/+1. This is a sweet creature for aggressive green decks since it poses a significant threat when it comes down early, and it sticks around until later in the game when it transforms into an even scarier beast horror that is likely to make mini boards lethal on the spot. In Standard, it was played in mono-green aggro decks. In Pioneer, it's been played in Devotion to Green. As we've seen, those decks are more than capable of producing the mana necessary to transform the Oddity, even in the relatively early game, which can be particularly terrifying, and the Oddity is still putting up top 8s in Pioneer right now. At number 4, it's Dragon Lord Atarka. For 5 generic, a red, and a green, it comes with flying and trample, and when it enters, it deals 5 damage divided among any number of creatures, planeswalkers, and opponents. So Atarka not only gives you a massive creature that can end the game in most cases in 2 swings, its enters trigger is also likely to have a massive impact on the game, so even if your opponent manages to kill Atarka, they are very likely still very far behind, and if they don't kill Atarka, the game's probably over. In Standard, it was played in a variety of decks, including that format's version of Devotion to Green, which later morphed into green ramp decks after Nykthos rotated out of the format. In Pioneer, it's been played in enigmatic incarnation decks, which can tutor up a singleton copy with the eponymous enchantment. In Modern, it's seen some play in Primeval Titan ramp decks, and in Legacy, it's sometimes cheated into play using Natural Order in Elf decks, which also happen to be really good at producing mana, so they can hardcast Dragon Lord Atarka too. Dragon Lord Atarka is still putting up some points in Pioneer right now. At number 3, it's Tyranax Rex. For 4 generic and 3 green, it can't be countered, and it comes with Trample, Ward 4, Haste, and Toxic 4, which means when it does any combat damage to a player, they get 4 poison counters, and of course, a player who gets 10 poison counters just loses the game. This brings a ton of size and keywords to the table. It can smash in for lots of damage and poison immediately. It's very difficult to block effectively, and it's hard to kill thanks to Ward 4. It's pretty scary even when you play it on schedule, but in all the decks it's been played in throughout multiple formats, it's usually coming down well before turn 7. In Standard, it's been played in ramp decks. In Pioneer, it gets put into play in Neoform decks, which can cast something like a cheap Hooting Mandrills early and sacrifice it to Neoform to put the huge Dino into play. In Modern, it's ramped into an Amulet Titan decks, and it even has some points in Legacy, where like Dragon Lord Atarka, it's pretty sweet to cheat into play using Natural Order. Basically, it's a great threat to turbo into play against opponents who are reliant on spot removal, and it can threaten to kill your opponents with poison or damage very quickly, so it's going to keep seeing significant play in many formats. The 2 cards in front of it are pretty active too though, and they have a significant lead, so Tyranax Rex may top out at number 3 on this list. At number 2, it's Cityscape Leveler. For a generic, it comes with Trample, and when you cast it and when it attacks, it destroys a non-land permanent and gives its controller a tapped Power Stone. It also has Unearth 8, which means you can pay that cost when it's in your graveyard, and return it to the battlefield with haste, and it gets sacrificed at the end of your turn. So yeah, as its name would indicate, it can completely reshape the board. It levels 1 permanent right away, can take out another every turn, and even when you think you've dealt with the problem, it comes back with Unearth and destroys another one. Upon being printed, the Leveler slotted right into decks capable of producing lots of mana in multiple formats. In Standard, it's put up some top 8s in Artifact ramp decks that lean on cards like the Might Stone and the Weak Stone, and Thran Spider. In Pioneer, it's yet another 8/8 that's been played in Devotion to Green decks, especially in the time when those decks had access to Karn the Great Creator. It's also played in the modern version of Devotion to Green, as well as Tron decks, which can produce massive amounts of mana in the early game with the Tron lands. It also sees play in modern Mono Black Control, another deck that uses Karn the Great Creator. In this case, the deck can produce lots of mana thanks to Cabal Coffers. The Leveler is likely to keep gaining points in multiple formats, and it has some chance of eventually catching the number 1 card on the list. For now, though, that card is Hogak Arisen Necropolis. Hogak is an infamously busted Magic card. For 5 generic and 2 black-green hybrid mana, it comes with Trample and can be cast from your graveyard, but you can't spend mana to cast Hogak. That last part would be a huge hurdle, but he also comes with 2 cost reduction mechanics, Convoke and Delve. These 2 abilities make it incredibly easy to cast. It was printed in Modern Horizons, so it was never legal in formats like Standard or Pioneer, but Modern, Legacy, and Vintage are all formats where loading the graveyard quickly is incredibly easy, and you can play Hogak like on turn 2 without too much trouble. This could be best accomplished with Bridge from Below and Altar of Dementia. The Bridge could populate the board from the graveyard for the Convoke, and the Altar could mill a ton of cards for the Delve. Hogak was only legal in Modern for 2 months before getting banned there, but it's been powerful enough to continue to put up points in the Eternal formats. It's found significant success in Legacy and Vintage Dredge decks, but its primary home in Vintage, of late, has been the Bazaar of Baghdad aggro deck, a deck loaded up with discard and draw effects like the Bazaar, that intends to then rapidly populate the board with creatures who can come out of the graveyard, or who have casting costs of 0. In that deck, it isn't that unusual for Hogak to come down on turn 1 alongside several other creatures. Hogak is going to continue to put up lots of points in both Legacy and Vintage, but it isn't doing it at a completely insane rate, and that's why Cityscape Leveler has a chance to one day be the number 1 card on the list. So those are the top 10 8/8 creatures in Magic. If you want to own any of these huge behemoths, check out the description where you can find a direct Card Kingdom link for each card that appeared in the video. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to make sure you're caught up on the 800 MTG top 10s that are out there, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.